Welcome to the world of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello, fellow Kith, and welcome to another episode of The World of Eora. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and thank you guys so much for joining into another episode where we dive into the news and lore for Pillars of Eternity and Avowed. For those who are unsure as to why we pair those two video games together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting. Eora is the setting for Pillars of Eternity and will be the setting for Avowed. So as the theory goes, if we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics of Pillars of Eternity, then perhaps we could glean some insights as to what Avowed will be like, or some things about Avowed that we can learn as it undergoes development at Obsidian Entertainment. We've recently been going through some episodes exploring the setting for the first Pillars of Eternity game, a location known as the Dyrwood. I've been going through a brief history of the Dyrwood, and we'll go over some of its culture and government later. But I have to take a moment to pause this review of Dyrwood's history, because the next installment of the lore book that I'm reading from talks about a subject called Animancy. And in order to understand this historical book of the Dyrwood properly, we kind of need to know what Animancy is. And so that's what this episode is going to be about. I have a previous episode entitled The Wheel, Audra, and the Soul, or something like that. That is kind of a precursor to this episode. In that episode, we go over a lot of the material that lays the foundation for what we'll be talking about here. So if you haven't yet listened to that episode, I would highly encourage you to pause this right now, go to that episode where it talks about the Wheel and Audra and the Soul, and a lot more of what we're talking about here will make sense. That said, if you don't have the time or you don't want to download it for the data, that's totally fine. I will give short recaps of things that are relevant to what we're talking about today, but I won't be as thorough as I would as if you listen to that episode. So that's just a little warning ahead for you. There shouldn't be any spoilers in today's episode. I'm trying to keep as many episodes spoiler-free as I possibly can. If there are any spoilers, minor or major, I will announce it ahead of time, and I will also count the seconds of how long it takes, go back and edit in how long to skip ahead for. So, anyways, with that, let's dive into the lore for Animancy.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
So, I've dropped this word Animancy several times now, and for those of you who have played Pillars of Eternity 1, you're definitely familiar with it. For others of you there, you might be wondering, what is this Animancy thing? It sounds kind of weird. I'm not really sure what it is. I'm going to give you a brief overview right now of what it is. Animancy, in short, is an academic field of study. So like if I said that I study biology or I study neuroscience, I could also say I study animancy. It's the designation given to a branch of study. And the branch of study that animancy focuses on is the study of what's called essence. And that's capital E, essence. Essence is the material, quote unquote, that your soul is made of. I have interpreted it as it's kind of like the building blocks that your soul is made of. It's almost like the substance. Like, you know how your body's made of carbon? The soul in Eora is made up of essence. That's kind of my interpretation of it. That's not like a canon thing. That's just how I like to interpret it. But essentially, your soul is made up of essence. And the study in Animancy is the study of essence. I think I've mistakenly called Animancy the science of the soul, which isn't incorrect, but it is a bit misleading, because it's not about studying the soul and how it behaves and how it attaches, well, maybe how it attaches to bodies. It's more of the actual stuff that the soul is made up of and how that ethereal essence, that ethereal material, for lack of a better, ethereal matter, there you go, that ethereal matter can be interacted with and manipulated and measured, etc., etc. It's kind of like the difference between neuroscience and psychology. Whereas studying the soul's behaviors and how it likes to act and interact with the world around it, that's more of a psychology. Whereas studying the actual ethereal matter that the soul is made of, this capital E essence, that's more like neuroscience. So that's kind of an analog to that. And so that is the general overview of what Animancy is. And everything that we see as a result of Animancy in the video games for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 happens as a result of studying this essence. Now, this does not justify in any way the level of importance that Animancy has in the world of Eora. Animancy is one of the central flavors of this fantasy setting that give the video games its unique taste. It is central. The idea of Animancy, the idea of the soul, and the idea of essence, it is central to the narratives that happen in Eora. It is central to Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2. And I'm guessing in Avowed, it's going to be very, very important, if not also central to the narrative and how your character involves him or herself in the world. If Avowed were to not include Animancy in a very deep and impactful way for the narrative and for your character, that would be a stark departure from where we started with Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2. Certainly Obsidian would be allowed to do this because they're making a brand new type of game. So it's not something that they couldn't do. They could make Animancy be something that you hear about but not necessarily engage with. I personally would be very disappointed if this were to happen because Animancy is such an interesting idea and it allows for so many concepts to be involved. I have played around with the idea of starting a Pillars of Eternity-esque Dungeons and Dragons type game, a tabletop role-playing game, and Animancy just writes campaigns for itself. So what am I talking about? Some of you guys are like, okay, get on with it. Like, explain what this is. Okay, how do they study the soul? How it works is that you are a Kith creature, so that's like you are a person in this world of Eora, and you have a soul. And to gloss over a lot of lore, which is in that episode I talked about, the souls in this world undergo cycles of reincarnation. And so the soul that you would have, theoretically, has lived past lives. And the unique person that you are exists as the melding of this body that you currently have and the soul that is inside that body. What Animancy could actually do is, using techniques, they could actually peer into previous lives of the soul or awaken old memories from previous lives in the person that's currently harboring that soul. That's an example of something that Animancy could do. How Animancy experiments like to work is they generally use this natural gemstone that exists within the world called Adra. Again, I talk about Adra in that episode I've mentioned before, so if you want to know more about that, go to that episode and listen to it. Short form of what Adra is, it's a naturally occurring gemstone that's unique to this fantasy setting. It kind of looks like jade. It's a large crystalline structure. It's not hard like diamonds. Jewelers within the narratives of Pillars of Eternity can take Adra and form jewelry with it, and you can make things out of it. But the unique thing about this jade-like crystal is that it's conductive for soul energy, for essence. Essence can pass through Adra just like electricity passes through copper wire. And actually, quite often, copper wiring will be used in Animancy experiments as well. I'm sure it has something to do with electricity or power that goes with it. I haven't dove that far into it or speculated that much, but it is involved quite a lot. And so using these devices and machines, Animancers are able to experiment with soul energy, the essence of a person, and manipulate it. You could transfer a soul from one vessel to another. You could try to fix a soul that is not strong, because as souls undergo cycles of reincarnation through what's called the wheel, the soul fragments. It essentially goes through entropy. It gets eroded. It wears down. And so you could technically have a weak soul. Having a weak soul in Eora leads to all sorts of problems. Josh Sawyer, the lead designer for the Pillars of Eternity games, said that the soul in Eora is the seat of consciousness, memory, and personality. And so if you have a weak soul, you have all these soul afflictions and soul maladies where you have personality disorders, you have memory lapses, or you can't form memories, or you are having consciousness issues. You could be an immoral person. It's a myriad of problems arise if you have a weak soul. And Animancy aims to interact with the stuff that your soul is made of. So theoretically, they could maybe mend it or put things together. And that's something else too. Can you store essence in a container like Adra and then take essence out and use it to repair souls that are broken down? There's a lot of experimentation that can come up when you start to think about the actual techniques they might use in Animancy. And so during the time of Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2, Animancy is kind of the central point for technology in the world. The technological era that Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 are in is like our Renaissance age. The age of exploration, I believe, is when the inspiration was for these games. And so you have a lot of technology that's up to par with that time in our own earthly history. But this Animancy science is also at the forefront of everything. No matter where you're playing, whether you're playing in the Dyrwood for Pillars of Eternity 1 or you're in the Deadfire Archipelago, the setting for Pillars of Eternity 2, Animancy is everywhere, and controversy surrounding Animancy is also everywhere. In fact, it's one of the main themes in Pillars of Eternity 1 is this tension between people who are in support of Animancy, helping to solve some of the narrative's problems, or people thinking that it's the cause of some of these problems, So there is that tension there, and there's a lot of topics that get hit in these narratives. And understandably so, because like a lot of people look at Animancy as dealing with things that are dead, because a lot of times the volunteers for Animancy experience are people who are dying or have recently died. And so it's kind of looked at like necromancy, which, doesn't generally have a positive outlook by the general public. Animancy has led to a lot of conflict and tension throughout history. In fact, in the Aedir Empire, which I talk about in previous episodes, it's one of the many nations of the world of Eora. They outlawed the practice of Animancy because of an experimentation that went horribly wrong. In the Aeoran calendar, which is designated AI, in 2260 AI, a group of Animancers transferred a soul into a dead body. But the reanimated body was just violent and aggressive, and it led to the creation of what are known now as the undead, and that is what led the Aedir Empire to outlaw Animancy. Horrible things can happen from this. For example, in Pillars of Eternity 1, you can dig into the lore and learn that like if a person is born without a soul, there are some techniques that Animancers have used or theorized they could use to combat this. Because if you're born without a soul in Eora, you're just catatonic. You just sit there and you breathe. You don't eat, you don't do anything. You just merely exist. And eventually you die because you're not taking care of yourself as an infant, which, you barely do in the first place. But Animancers were theorizing that what you could do was you could implant the soul of, say, something like an animal into an infant kith child. So like, you could implant the soul of an animal into this child, and then it would have that battery in it, then it would have that thing that gives it life. And surprisingly enough, this actually worked for a little bit, except until these kids reached adolescence, and they became these monstrous creatures known as wicks. And these creatures called wicks are a plague in the Dyrwood, in a lot of areas, and also like really, really unnerving. It's hard to notice it when you're playing an isometric RPG sometimes, but like if you come across a wict, you fight it, it looks like it's just, this weird crawling kind of dying creature, but it's actually supposed to be like a child that turned into a monster. That's a freaky idea. And of course, that led to people being really, really, really against Animancy. People were hating them for this kind of thing. Animancers particularly work in urban areas because there's more protection. In rural zones, if people don't like you as much in the Dyrwood, then they kind of take the law into their own hands. So it's not as safe for Animancers to practice out in the open everywhere. They kind of need to be in a place that's safe. And so I already mentioned one notable event in the history of Animancy was the Aedir Empire outlawing Animancy because they created undead. But this isn't the first time that Animancy has run into issues. In 2704, so 34 years after the one that happened in the Aedir Empire, over in the Dyrwood, which is in a new continent entirely, the Animancers were working at a place called Balereach, and they accidentally shattered the souls of about a dozen volunteers there. And so there were these volunteers, they were helping out with these animancy experiments, and we don't know the specifics of what happened, but essentially the souls of these people just got completely shattered, burst into pieces. I don't know how you picture that happening. But either way, like, this experimentation led to a catastrophic conclusion. The citizens of the area apparently stormed the houses of these animancers, or I think it was just one animancer, and they killed this guy. And this is actually the catalyst that caused a lot of animancers to move from rural areas to urban areas where they could get safety. And this led to them actually founding a sanitarium called Brackenberry, which is an institution where animancers go and they kind of work together and study the field of animancy together in the safety of a city known as Defiance Bay. And this isn't the only kind of conflict that animancers have had. If you have been listening to the history of the Dyrwood, you'll know that there is a long-standing tension between the Dyrwooden colonists who came over from Aedir, the nation of the Aedir Empire, these Dyrwooden colonists, and the local natives that were already living in this land, the Glanfathans. There's a lot of tension between these two factions because these colonists come over and they start exploring these ancient ruins, which are considered holy sites to these Glanfathan people. And these colonists are just stealing all these ancient artifacts and plundering these ancient ruins for themselves. And conflict starts to arrive, so the colonists decide that they're going to take the Glanfathans and turn them into slaves. This leads to a couple of wars, which you can all hear about if you listen to the history of the Dyrwood. Anyways, it wasn't just people plundering for artifacts that were there. There were also animancers diving into these ruins for ancient knowledge and finding ancient devices from a long-gone civilization that apparently knew about animancy. So animancers were also part of the group of people that were causing this conflict and tension between the colonists and the Glanfathans. Why is this important? This is important because in 2780, which is only 76 years after the last incident I told you about, the Dyrwooden government that has been established at this point started working together with Glanfathan tribal societies, and the Animancers were sent from the Dyrwood over to Glanfathan tribes, and they kind of trained and learned together. So the Glanfathans had these things called mind hunters, people who were trained and had abilities in cipher class magic, which is kind of like a psionic class in more traditional fantasy settings, if that's what you're used to. They were starting to work together, which is a monumental step towards peace between these two factions in the game. But the Animancers and the Glanfathans were starting to work together, and they both were able to learn new heights of animancy that had previously been unthought of before. And this is starting to get to the time where Pillars of Eternity 1 takes place, which is in the early-ish area of the 2800s. And animancy, as I've been explaining and showing you guys, has been quite controversial in the narrative for not just Pillars of Eternity, but the setup of the world that Obsidian wrote for this. Even all this doesn't do justice to what animancy is and what it can do. I mean, it's cool to think of, okay, yeah, you got these scientists and they're working with the essence of what a soul is made of, but, like, what does that actually do? It sounds cool, but, like, how does the rubber hit the road for a lot of this? Like, if you stop and you think about it for a second, like, what are some things that you could do? Well, if you could look into the past life of a person, could you look into the life before that? Could you look 2 lives ago? Could you look 3 lives ago? Could you look 25 lives ago? Could you go back to the very first life that somebody had with their soul? What if you tried to look at the very infancy, the very origin of where this soul came from, Could you, through animancy, learn how to achieve immortality, as some animancers have? Could you find a way to keep the soul from leaving the body and keeping that body alive? Could you put the soul into another vessel so that your soul lives on in something that won't actually physically die? When you get the companion, Devil of Karok, from the White March DLC, you learn very quickly that that is exactly who that is. That is a person who had their soul implanted into a metallic vessel. And that's where this person is kind of quote-unquote alive now. Could you reawaken past lives so that you could experience the memories of before? Would people pay for a service like that where they could experience past memories like it was a movie or something? Could you suppress memories so that you wouldn't experience them anymore? Can you repair the soul so that if you were a weak-souled person, you are now a strong-souled person? Could you hire somebody to make another person a weak-souled person because you don't want them to be a strong-souled person? What is the connection between the body and the soul? Are you able to turn physical matter into this ethereal matter and vice versa? And if Adra is conductive to soul energy, and you could find a way to get your physical matter to become kind of like soul energy, could you then use Adra as a teleportation system? Because there are miles of this stuff underneath the surface of Eora that are running through everywhere. So you could theoretically use it to transport from one location to another. How many souls could you store in a piece of Adra? And what would happen if you melded two souls together? There's so many questions that you could come up with that we just don't have answers to. Some of them we do. There's a guy in the lore for Eora named Pangram who tried to achieve immortality, and he also ended up creating undead as well by putting the soul, I think, into a dead body, or someone who was dying into... I can't remember the specifics of it. Some of these things have been attempted, sometimes with not very good results. But those are just some ideas that I have there. And like I mentioned before, if you're making a tabletop game, like a D&D style campaign out of this world, those ideas right there would be a great foundation for an entire campaign. A secret faction that tries to use Animancy to achieve one of these goals. How do they do that, and what's going on in the background, and how do your characters get introduced to that kind of narrative? It could practically write itself. And I personally find it very interesting. And so that's kind of an overview of what Animancy is and how it can be used. These Animancers use Adra and copper wiring, as well as some of the psionic powers I was talking about with those mine hunters and ciphers. They use people who have that kind of natural ability to perform Animancy experiments. Now, if you look into the history of how Animancy developed, you also see that, like any science, it develops in terms of technique and understanding. Actually, if you go into the Collector's Book for Pillars of Eternity, we can learn what those evolutions of Animancy were. And so, a brief overview of that, it starts with phrenology, which is essentially, it began with a question of where was the soul anchored to the kith body? So the idea of okay, we know that people have souls, but where in the body is the soul anchored? Because we know it's connected to the body in some way, but we can't pull it out with, forceps or something. I don't know, whatever surgical tool you have out there. Likely, seemed pretty intuitive that it would be the brain, because it involves intelligence and awareness. So they studied phrenology, they studied cranial shapes, and hoping to deduce things about the soul. This stage of Animancy was really early. There wasn't a lot that came as a result of this. However, if I remember correctly, this is where they actually learned that copper was a useful tool in experimentation. And so this is where Animancers started using copper rings to help with these experiments. From there, it moved on to trepanning, which is a process of boring a hole into the skull to relieve pressure. They started using trepanning to, I guess, get really in there, to really start seeing where is that soul? We're going to find you. So in 2732, surgeons were able to successfully expose brain matter to try to relieve the suffering of a person who had a soul ailment. They put a copper antenna to the brain tissue, and the report of the scene goes like this. There was a watcher in attendance, and a quick review of what a watcher is. A watcher is someone who has this innate, strong ability to see soul energy, essence. They can see and interact and manipulate soul essence as if it was just something they could do. They're just stretching a muscle. They are able to interact with and see and manipulate essence. So a watcher was in attendance. They were boring a hole into someone's head, and they put a copper wire to it, and this is what the watcher saw. That an ethereal mist raveled snake-like up the shaft of the instrument, that is the copper wire. And this indicated that the prod was passively attracting soul matter. And so this confirms the idea that copper wiring attracts soul energy. From there, the science of animancy evolved more into something called harmonic feedback therapy. A person's soul in Eora could become what's known as awakened. And what happens then is that you, living alive right now, suddenly become very aware of one or more past lives that your soul lived through, and they start to bubble to the forefront of your psyche. And so, kind of without your permission or say so, this other personality will just start to come to fruition. You will start acting like it. You'll still think you yourself, but now you're acting in this completely alien way to people around you, and you don't think you're acting any different. It might not be till later when you're reflecting on your actions that you're like, no, that was actually one of my past personalities coming back. And so, like, this can lead to a fracturing of your identity, and it can actually lead to madness, as you can clearly understand. So harmonic feedback therapy was something that animancers came up with as a way to treat this. What they did was they performed an experiment by using sonic waves from a copper wire and a tuning fork. Theory was that by activating every latent soul at the same time, that they would kind of like cancel each other out. A watcher on the scene reported that the patient literally was bursting with light from their perspective before she just essentially went into a dissociative fugue state. So just empty, just catatonic. I don't know if they shattered her soul in the process, or if her soul got canceled out, or if they are all just fighting for power over this body, or who knows. It kind of reminds me of like the movie Split, where James McAvoy's character has all these different personalities and they hold on to the light, and then that's when they get control of the body of that person's body. It kind of gives me a little bit of those vibes there, talking about that. After harmonic feedback therapy came something called magnetic field manipulation. At this point, they've well established that copper is known to be a very instrumental part in understanding what essence is. And so they wanted to see what would happen if they subjected a soul to large quantities of just straight raw copper. So what they did was they buried an individual in a metal box deep underground near a large vein of copper and adra, which was also known to be used in experiments with essence. 3 days later, they dug up the site and found the box was there, but that the person was missing entirely. Who knows what happened there? I don't even have a crazy theory of what could happen. There is someone in the lore of Eora who is trying to use Adra as a teleportation system, and I don't know if they were successful or not, but it's one of the stronghold missions that you can send one of your companions on. There's kind of a hint that the person was successful in transferring their body and soul into the Adra, but they never came out. At least that's what's hinted at. I wonder if this is something like what happened to this person, who was buried next to a large Adra and copper vein, and then their body and soul just got sucked up because of the conductivity. After that came tidal magnetism therapy. So given all the results that have happened with experiments from copper and its magnetic fields, animancers tried to utilize one of the moons of Eora. There's 2 moons of Eora. The idea is that the pull of the moon has known effects on essence, the stuff that soul is made of. So what they tried to do was they tried to perform an experiment to see how souls would react to the moon in its next orbit. However, what they didn't account for was that the second moon would also be coming in orbit at the same time. They weren't really aware of the second moon that well. They didn't know what its orbiting patterns were. And so when that second moon came by, it caused what's known as a lover's tide to happen, which is an absolutely like cataclysmic natural event. It completely ruined the experiment. Another evolution in animancy studies is known as spiritual prosthesis. And so the idea of spiritual prosthesis is that you would remove the soul of a kith person and put it in something else. At this point in the science, removing a soul was actually quite standard. People have been able to just do this regularly. That's just part of the practice. However, implanting a soul into another body or another vessel was not something that was standard issue. And animancers have been trying to do this, especially since that there was an increase in hollow-born children, which are children born without a soul. They're trying to find ways to take souls out of bodies and then implant them into these hollow children. which is another question of like, I wonder if that would extend mortality or make you immortal. Could you take your soul out of your dying body and implant it into a hollow child and thus keeping yourself going? Would you be able to keep those memories? Would you be able to find a way to like program your soul so those memories would stay alive forever? Research in this area continues to this day, at least during the time of Pillars of Eternity. And this hasn't seen a lot of development yet. This is kind of where Animancy is now, is they're actually working with souls and removing them, and they're trying to find ways to put them back into things. Interestingly enough, with the Devil of Karak, the companion that you get from the White March DLC, we see that there is successful examples of that. So that part of the science is growing, and it is seeing productivity, albeit slow ones. But the idea of Animancy is kind of heading towards what's known as immortality studies. It's the idea the Animancers are wanting to find ways to reach complete immortality through the field of Animancy. And so whether they do things like diving into necromantic type magic or finding ways to keep the soul from not going into the cycle of reincarnation and thereby fracture the soul and erode itself, it can stay strong forever. They're also finding ways to keep bodies healthy and keep souls in those bodies so that they can't leave. And that way the body, in a sense, never really dies because it doesn't have that life in it when the soul leaves. And that's kind of where Animancy is today. Now, if you're playing Pillars of Eternity 1 or 2, there are a few books that you can read that talk about Animancy, one of which is the Animancy in the Modern Age, and the other is The Life and Discoveries of Pangram, which is a infamous Animancer from the past. And I've mentioned him before about trying to actually work on that immortality. And so in that book, Animancy in the Modern Age, we can actually read a journal excerpt of the experiment that led to the outlaw of Animancy in the Aedir Empire. Which is interesting because all the documentation of this experiment had been destroyed for the safety of the public, but this journal entry had survived in this book known as Animancy in the Modern Age. So if we read it, we can actually see the results of what happened. To give a little background, there was a young and wealthy person who had an infirm body, and the idea was that they would take his soul out of his body and put it in that of a body that was recently deceased from that of an accident. There was very little decay, and so the idea was that the body would accept the soul and then it would come back to life, and he would be able to live on in this new body. This is kind of the result of what happens. The writer of the journal says, "It is done, and the gods forgive us for our arrogance. I am not sure what I was expecting. Certainly not that. But what did any of us expect? Still, behind the revulsion, there is a sense of pride, something I can't deny. All the research, the studying, everything we worked for, we thought we'd change the world. How it's changed. All was in place, the twisted form lying on the table next to its new vessel, the equipment had been prepared, the tinctures and potions all carefully crafted, every detail painstakingly organized to ensure success. We most assuredly succeeded. The procedure went exactly as it should. The soul, extracted from the old body, held, bound in place to prevent it from moving on. Then the next step, transfer to the fresh vessel. It was beautiful and terrifying. I listened as they spoke the words of binding. I watched the soul move. Not the soul itself, of course, but the vapor we used to detect it. As it lowered into the vessel, a gentle luminescence covering the body, and then nothing. Silence, darkness. I held my breath, afraid that even the slightest disturbance would destroy all of our hard work. Then motion. Then, dear gods, then blood. And how did I survive? I do not know. The vessel rose from the slab, and the room breathed. Every person crowded around the tables exhaled. Some cheered. We had made life from death. We had become eternal. The body closed its eyes and tilted its head, looking for all purposes to be listening for something or to it. Then its eyes popped open and it moved. Its lips peeled back from its teeth in a horrible expression of fury. It fell on the nearest man, tearing his throat, knocking him to the ground. Then the room erupted into screams, shouts, and a flurry of bodies, running, pushing, doing everything in their power to get away from the creature sitting on their colleague. But right when that happened, in the split second before the chaos, when there was nothing in the air but a stunned, terrified silence, I heard it, sitting there on his chest, face at his neck, and it was feasting. So there you have the vivid description by wonderful writers at Obsidian of how that experiment ended up and why Animancy got outlawed. And so this is how we can see that a lot of people associate Animancy with necromancy. I mean, they literally were trying to raise a dead body in a way, so that's kind of understandable. And so there we have an overview of Animancy, what it is, how it works, and some examples of how it can go wrong or possibly go right. I mean, if you go into the Sacred Stairs area in Nekataka, a city which is in Pillars of Eternity 2, you can engage with Animancers there who are trying to learn how to use Adra for teleportation. And they're kind of successful. You know, there are stories of Animancers who are restoring people's lives when you talk to NPCs in the game or you read up on stories within the books that are in the game itself. There's a lot of good that can come out of this. The science is still early, and there's so much more that Obsidian can do with it. And it's very clear that this is something that they want to include in their games. And it's for that reason that I really believe it's going to be part of Avowed, because it's so intertwined with what makes Eora have its flavor that I don't think you could take that out and have the same story or the same game or the same world. I would expect in Avowed that we should be having a similar kind of experience, that we should be having Animancy at the forefront, or it's something that your character can engage in, or maybe it's a skill that you can learn stuff in and you can use out in the field. Maybe your character will be a watcher, maybe your character can have a cipher class, I don't know, but it's definitely going to be something that's involved in Avowed. If the subject of Animancy interests you, I highly recommend you play Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2. If you're into that kind of stuff, if you're like learning about that in fantasy settings and you're getting excited about Avowed, I highly recommend playing those two games and getting into it. If you get Pillars of Eternity, I think if you get the definitive and ultimate editions on PC, it comes with collector's books and guidebooks in the game files on your PC, which you can use to read up on actually more lore, on advances in Animancy that go on. There's a lot that you can dive into. This episode has gone on long enough. I don't want to beat this to death and repeat things over and over again. I'm sure I already have. But it's such a big topic, and it's hard to really encompass everything that Animancy is. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode, and I hope I can talk about this more in the future. But for now, this is everything that we need to know about Animancy, and we can return to our series of looking at the Dyrwood in history so that we can understand what it is they're talking about in the next lore book for that history. Thank you guys for joining me for today's episode on Animancy. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to reach me, you can email me, worldofaora@gmail.com, or you can send me a message on Twitter @worldofaora. While I was gone over the summer, I actually received several emails from people that were encouraging me in the internship I was doing, and just talking about the podcast and talking about Pillars of Eternity, and it was so awesome. I was loving it. It honestly, it put wind in my sails. Over the course of the summer, I was like, oh, I miss doing the podcast. I can't wait to go back home. But I'm like, is it really adding value to people at all? And, is it worth the time? And it seemed like it was really resonating with, I only got several emails, but those are people that spoke up. Thank you guys for sending those emails, and for those of you who reached out, and for those of you who listened, thank you so much. I'm glad to be back, and I can't wait to dive into more lore as we wait for Avowed to come out and as we continue to play Pillars of Eternity. Thanks so much, guys. This is Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.